I've delivered groceries to a lot of houses. That's what happens when you run apps full-time. You become a ghost in people's lives. In and out. Ring the bell, drop the bags, maybe get a nod or a thank you, and then back to the car next. Address. Next list. You stop remembering faces because most of them never really see you. You're a transaction, convenience. But that Thursday afternoon, everything changed. It was a quiet street on the edge of town. Big maples lining the curb. Older homes with porch swings and cracked driveways. The kind of place where you can still hear the mail being delivered. Her house was at the end of the block's single-story brick. Neat hedges, ceramic wind chimes by the door. I'd been there once before. A week prior, she'd ordered almond milk, gluten-free bread, organic frozen blueberries. Do you get a sense? Of someone through their groceries. This time, I knocked like always. She opened the door with that same calm, composed look she'd had the last time. Gray hair pulled back in a low bun, no makeup. Just a cozy blue sweater and that kind of presence that comes from someone who doesn't feel the need to fill silence. She looked like someone who used to run the world and now just wanted to sit on her porch and watch it spin without her. Again, she said with a little smile. Would you mind bringing those inside? My knee's been giving me trouble today. Of course I said yes. No problem. She stepped back, and I carried in the bags 2 trips. Kitchen was clean, bright, smelled like cinnamon and rosemary. A teapot sat on the stove, still warm. She leaned on the counter as I placed the last bag down. And then, just as I turned to head out, she said it. Can I ask you something? I paused. Sure. She tilted her head slightly, watching me with a look that wasn't flirtatious. It was earnest, measured, maybe even a little guarded. Do you think 52 is too old for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't laugh. I didn't joke. She wasn't joking. That was obvious from the way she held her breath after she asked it. Like the question had cost her something. Stood there for a second, searching for the right words, and all I could say was the truth. No, I don't. She looked relieved, but not because she believed me. More because I didn't dismiss her. She turned toward the fridge, started putting things away slowly. I don't know what made me ask. Just ... Lately I've been wondering if I'm past the window. You know? Out. Like I missed the last boat, and now I'm just watching the tide roll out. I stayed. I don't know why. I could have just said thanks, wished her well, and left. But I didn't. I leaned against the edge of the counter and asked, why now? Why today? She paused for a moment, then said, because I've spent the last few years surviving, getting through. Raising kids, burying my mother, closing down a business. You hit a point where the noise dies down, and suddenly you're just alone with your questions. That one's been echoing louder than the rest lately. It hit me harder than I expected. Because even though I was younger, even though our lives looked different on paper, I understood exactly what she meant. Life quiets down, and suddenly you're left face to face with everything you'd been too busy to feel. We talked for 10 minutes, then 20. She made tea, and I stayed long enough for it to steep. Her name was Eva. She used to teach high school English, divorced for 7 years, 2 grown kids, both out of state. Her life had become routines, predictable, neat, and painfully quiet. She told me she hadn't been on a date in nearly a decade. I wouldn't even know where to begin, she said with a little laugh. Apps, meet cutes at the produce section. My life's not a romantic comedy, I told her honestly. Maybe it doesn't have to be a comedy. Maybe it's just about being open. Again, that line seemed to sit with her, like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Eventually, I had to leave. Other deliveries, other doors. But something about that conversation stuck, and apparently, it stuck with her too, because the next time I saw her just 3 days later, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. It wasn't a date. Not really. She framed it as a thank you. You've been kind, she said. It would be nice to cook for someone again. I said yes. That night was the beginning of something I never saw coming. Not romance. Not yet. Just ... presence. Two people stepping into each other's orbits, without rushing to name the gravity. I'd go on to visit her again and again. Groceries turned into dinners. Dinners turned into conversations that ran past midnight. We started to share more than just space. We shared stories, wounds, laughter, regrets. And slowly, without us realizing it, something began to form, not loudly. That was sparks. With warmth, I showed up that Sunday evening with a bag of takeout, not groceries. She insisted on cooking. But I figured if I was going to sit at her table, I could at least contribute something. Bread from the little bakery on 5th, that kind with the cracked crust and too much flour dusted on top. She opened the door before I knocked, like she'd been waiting, not impatient, not expectant. Just aware of the time and way people are when they've been alone for too long. The house smelled. Different that night. Richer. Garlic and thyme. Something cooking low and slow on the stove. She wore a long cardigan and leggings, barefoot again, her hair down this time. She looked casual, but there was a softness to her I hadn't seen before. Less guarded. She took the bread, thanked me, and motioned toward the table where 2 plates were already set. Cloth napkins, real silverware. No candles, no music, just food and space. We ate slowly, the kind of slow that comes not from savoring the meal, but from wanting the moment to stretch longer. Her cooking was incredible: roasted, chicken thighs, herb potatoes, something green and warm I couldn't name but went back for seconds of. She didn't say much at first, just small observations. The bread was perfect. The weather was turning. Her daughter had finally texted back after a week of silence. She didn't complain, didn't dwell, just floated these pieces of her life across the table and let me catch what I could. After dinner, we stayed at the table with tea. She poured loose leaves into a little pot and steeped them while I cleared the dishes. No protest, no insistence on handling it alone. That in itself said something. I dried while she rinsed. We didn't talk much, just exchanged glances, small smiles. But something was shifting. Not dramatically. No, not in big gestures. Just in the way we moved near each other. Like people who weren't used to being seen, but were starting to want it again. When we sat back down, she looked at me like she was reading a line she'd underlined in a book years ago. Like she wasn't sure why it stuck with her, but it had. "You said something the other day," she began. "Something about not needing a romantic comedy, just being open again." I nodded, unsure where she was headed. I thought about that. "All weekend," she continued, "because I've spent years shutting doors in my mind, quietly, without even realizing it. And now it's like they're creaking open again, and I'm standing there, scared of what might walk through." I didn't say anything. She didn't need reassurance. She just needed space to speak. "I used to love," she said finally. "I was the kind of woman who believed in handwritten notes and long hugs and staying up too late talking under blankets. And then, ... life happened. Marriage turned into management. Affection became duty. And when it ended, I didn't mourn the man. I mourned the version of me that used to believe in softness. That hit me in the gut, because I'd seen that happen. Before, with friends, with family, with myself, maybe. Love becomes survival. Intimacy becomes transaction. And before you know it, your heart's got a do not disturb sign on it just to keep the noise out. I think I forgot how to flirt," she added with a laugh. Not in the wink across room kind of way, but the real kind. The leaning -in because -you -care -what -someone -thinks kind of way. I could feel that vulnerability in the air, like we were both standing closer to something neither of us had planned on. It wasn't about sparks. It was about warmth, familiar, safe. We talked until nearly midnight, not about love, not directly. About books, about music, about how she used to sing to herself in the car and hadn't done it in years until last week. About the time she almost moved to New Mexico because a man she loved couldn't leave his hometown. About regret. Not in a bitter way, but in that honest tone people use when they've made peace with the fact that the road behind them is unchangeable. But the one ahead still has space. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't follow me to the door this time. She stayed seated, holding her tea mug with both hands, eyes steady on mine. "Thank you," she said. I knew it wasn't just for the bread. "Same time next week?" "Ah." She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah, let's try that." On the drive home, the city felt quieter than usual. Or maybe I was just more aware of it, different kind of silence. The kind that settles in when something new has begun, not with fireworks or declarations, but with two people willing to meet each other where they are. Over the next few days, I thought about her often. About the way her eyes softened when she listened. About how careful she was with her words, not because she didn't have things to say, but because she wanted them to mean something when she finally did. I kept replaying little moments in my head, the way she touched her wrist, absent-mindedly when she spoke about her past, the way she glanced toward the hallway like she could still hear footsteps in it, the way her voice dropped when she asked if I thought 52 was too old for love. I didn't have an answer yet. It's not a good one. Not the kind you say just to make someone feel better, because I was starting to realize love doesn't ask for your age, it asks for your openness, your presence, your willingness to stay, even when it's hard. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to stay. The following Sunday came with gray skies and that low, this ambient chill that seeps into your jacket, no matter how thick it is. It's a kind of weather that makes you think twice before leaving the house, unless you've got something or someone you're really looking forward to. And despite the cold, I was looking forward to seeing her again. Not in the way people talk about dates or crushes, but in that grounded way you look forward to returning to a place that makes you feel more yourself. That's what being around her felt like: undemanding presence, no pretense, no noise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I brought her favorite oranges from the farmer's market that time. She hadn't asked, hadn't hinted, but I remembered how she paused the last time while peeling one from the grocery bag, saying something about how store-bought never tasted like the ones her grandmother used to bring home in a brown paper sack. It wasn't a gift, wasn't some grand romantic gesture, just an act of listening and showing her that I had. When she opened the door, I noticed she had music playing in the background, jazz, the kind with slow horns and brushed snares. She had that same comfortable look again, loose sweater, socks. On the hardwood, sleeves rolled past her wrists. Her smile wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. It was soft and real, like it belonged there between us. "You read my mind," she said, spotting the oranges. I was just thinking I hadn't had a real one in years. I stepped inside, let the door click close behind me, and followed her into the kitchen. The light outside filtered through the windows, in soft streaks, casting everything in that faded glow that makes even quiet houses feel alive. We didn't rush into conversation this time. We didn't need to. There was something about our rhythm now that didn't require warming up. I helped her peel one of the oranges and we ate them over the sink, the juice running just slightly down our fingers, laughing when she handed me a paper towel that already had a hole in the middle. It was simple. Something powerful settling between us. Not desire. Not longing. Just attention. Focus, steady, and rare. Afterward, we moved to the living room, mugs of fresh coffee in hand. And she pulled a blanket over both our legs like it was second nature. The couch creaked just a bit when we settled in, the kind of honest sound furniture makes when it's been lived with and loved through seasons. The jazz played on. She had a book open beside her, some old collection of poetry, but she didn't read from it. She just let her fingers rest on the pages like they were part of her. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," she said eventually. "About being open again." Her voice was steady, but I could feel something behind it, like a person leaning their weight against a door that had been locked for too long. Not ready to burst through, but ready to see if the hinges still worked. "It scares me," she admitted. "Not because I think I'm too old. I think, I'm just out of practice. I've lived so long without expecting affection that I'm not sure I'd know how to receive it anymore. I'm good at conversation, at presence, but intimacy. It's like trying to speak a language I haven't used since college. I didn't rush in with solutions. I didn't give her some rehearsed wisdom about how love is timeless or how everyone deserves a second chance. She already knew that. What she didn't know was whether she could let herself want it again without shame. And that's a much harder thing to untangle. Sometimes, I said after a while, we don't need to know how it ends to start letting it in. We just need someone who won't rush the middle. That landed. She looked over at me, her eyes a little shinier than before. Not from sadness, but recognition. We spent the afternoon like that, just being, talked about our first heartbreaks. Both surprised we remembered them so clearly. We talked about music, her love for Nina Simone, my weakness for old soul records that remind me of my dad's car. We talked about how time seems to shrink when you stop avoiding silence. And somewhere between the second and third mug of coffee, she reached over and touched my arm just to graze. Just a moment, but it was intentional, deliberate, a thank you without words. When the sun dipped lower and the window light turned golden, she stood and stretched, bones cracking softly. She walked to the kitchen and came back with a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something after you left last week," she said. "Didn't know if I'd share it, but ... well, here." She handed it to me and sat back down without explanation. I unfolded it and saw her handwriting, curved, careful, no corrections. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a poem, it was just thoughts. About stillness, about being seen, about not being asked to hurry toward healing. One line stopped me cold. Maybe I don't need someone to rescue me. Maybe I just need someone who won't walk away when I finally stop pretending I'm fine. I didn't look up right away. I let the words settle, let them land in that part of me that had long stopped expecting to be trusted like that. When I finally looked at her, she didn't ask me what I thought. She just said, "Thank you for showing up." And somehow, those 5 words felt more intimate than any I'd heard in years. The days between Sundays started to feel longer. I didn't admit it to myself at first, but it was there, this quiet anticipation that built all week. Like I was, living in between parentheses, waiting for the next time I'd walk through her door. My other deliveries felt more transactional now. The faces at those doors faded faster. I'd catch myself looking at the time, counting backward from when I'd next see her, and then trying not to read too much into that. When Sunday came again, I was early. It's not obviously just 15 minutes, under the excuse that traffic had been better than expected, but she noticed. She noticed everything. The way her eyes flicked to the clock and back to me, the small smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth, like she knew but wasn't going to say anything. She'd made soup this time. Lentil and sweet potato, with warm bread wrapped in a dish. Towel. The house smelled like cumin and rosemary, and something sweeter I couldn't place. The windows were fogged slightly from the simmering pot, and her hair was pulled up again loosely, with strands falling around her temples. She looked tired, but not in a way that suggested defeat. More like someone who'd been carrying too much for too long and had finally let herself set it down. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, bowls steaming between us, and something in the air felt more charged than usual. It's not romantic. Not yet, but aware. Like we were both quietly acknowledging that this whatever this was had outgrown its original purpose. I wasn't just the delivery guy anymore. She wasn't just the woman behind the door. She asked me about my life this time. It's not surface-level stuff. Real things, where I'd grown up. Why I'd chosen flexible work over a 9-to-5. What I wanted from the next 5 years, not professionally, but personally. No one had asked me that in a long time. Maybe ever. Stumbled through my answer, not because I didn't have thoughts, because no one had ever sat across from me. Elbows on the table, eyes locked on mine, and waited for me to really answer. When I asked her the same, she laughed. Not out of deflection, but surprise. "I don't think I've let myself want much in the last decade," she said. Wanting things meant risking disappointment. So I stopped making lists. She paused, chewing slowly, then added, "But if I had to say it now, I want presence, not performance. I want to feel something real, even if it's small." We stayed at that table longer than usual, refilled our bowls, talked about nothing for a while, movies, music we missed, books we hadn't finished. But underneath it all, there was a new rhythm. Something slower, but more deliberate. We weren't just passing time anymore. We were building something. Quietly, carefully. Later, we moved to the couch again, blanket over our knees, fire flickering in the background. She brought out a photo album this time, not to reminisce, not to show off, but to share. She flipped slowly through the pages, childhood pictures of her kids, holidays, blurry snapshots from hiking trips. One old photo of her and her ex-husband that she lingered on longer than the others. "I don't miss him," she said. "Not the person. But I do miss the idea of being part of something, of being chosen." That honesty didn't scare me. It made me respect her more. Because that's the part people don't talk about after divorce or long-term solitude. Just the pain of what ended, but the ache for what's missing now. The absence of routine affection. The loss of touch. The silence after the last goodnight. She turned the page and smiled at a photo of herself on a beach. Arms thrown back, sun in her eyes. "That was the last time I remember feeling light," she said. "Really light. Like I wasn't carrying anything." She looked over at me then. "You make me feel a little like that again. Not all the way, but closer." That landed in my chest harder than I expected. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real, rare. When I left that night, it was harder to pull myself away. She stood in the doorway like usual, arms folded lightly over her chest, her hip resting against the frame. I stood on the porch, hands in my jacket pockets, the cold nipping at my neck. And we just looked at each other for a long beat, no words, no wave, just something unspoken holding steady between us. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept seeing her face in the warm light of the kitchen, kept hearing her voice saying she wanted to feel something real, kept thinking about how I'd gone from delivering groceries to becoming part of someone's rediscovery, and wondering what part of me was being rediscovered in return, because that was the truth. I hadn't wanted to face yet. I wasn't just showing up for her. I was starting to show up for myself, too. It's strange how quickly we adjust to things we never expected. A few weeks earlier, she'd been a stranger on a delivery app, name on a list, an address at the bottom of a receipt. But now her house had become a place I moved through like it knew me. The hallway creaked differently under my steps. The couch cushion had started to remember the way I sat. The air always smelled faintly of something warm: lavender, cinnamon, tea leaves steeped too long. And maybe what struck me most was how natural it had all started to feel. Like she and I had carved out this tiny corner of time, free from the noise outside, where we didn't have to be anything except honest. That next visit came on a Tuesday, unplanned. She had texted that morning, "Do you have time today?" Not for anything specific, just ... I'd like some company. I told her I'd be by around 5. She replied with a thumbs up emoji, which made me smile more than I'd like to admit. When I arrived, she opened the door wearing reading glasses, and a knit shawl draped over her shoulders like something out of a quiet novel. Her hair was damp, likely just washed, her eyes tired but open. There was no pretense. She didn't apologize for how she looked. She didn't try to explain why she'd reached out. She just stepped aside and let me in. The lights in the house were low. A single lamp in the corner, the golden kind with a faded shade and soft light. It made the whole space feel smaller, closer, more intimate, without trying. I followed her into the kitchen, where a pot of water was already warming on the stove, and a small plate of shortbread cookies sat between 2 mugs. She said, "I wasn't in the mood to cook tonight," and I said, "I didn't come for the food." That made her smile in that quiet way she did when she didn't want to show how much something meant. We sat at the table. Just tea, the rain ticking gently at the windows, and to people who weren't quite sure what this was becoming. And I think that's why it worked, because neither of us forced it into a shape. We let it form in the quiet, in the pauses, in the permission to exist without titles. She asked me about my week. I told her about a flat tire and an old woman who insisted on tipping me with a coupon for frozen yogurt. She told me her daughter had called, finally, and it had been a good conversation. Not deep, not emotional, just good. And sometimes good is the highest hope you carry into a phone call with family. At some point, her hand drifted to mine across the table. Not deliberate, not staged. It just happened, as the tips of her fingers brushed mine, and for a second neither of us moved. I didn't grab her hand. She didn't pull away. We just let our skin speak in the absence of words. There was nothing electric about it. It's no cinematic flash. Just warmth, familiarity, the sensation of being trusted. She looked at me and said, "I think the hardest part of being alone for so long isn't the quiet, it's the absence of witness. No one sees your little joys." No one says that. Must have been hard. You end up doubting your own experience because it passes without acknowledgement. I let that sit for a second, because I'd never heard it put quite like that, but she was right. There's something deeply human about being seen. Not praised, not validated, just seen. We live entire lives with people brushing past us online. In stores, in cars, and we forget how much it matters to be gently observed without judgment. "I don't need fireworks," she said, "but I do need presence. Someone to laugh at the bad movie I chose. Someone to hand me a towel before I realize I forgot one. Someone who sees me messy, tired, imperfect, and stays anyway." That last part hit different. Not just because of what she said, but because I'd never been described that way as someone who stays anyway. Between short connections, temporary roles, unfinished chapters, I hadn't realized how much I wanted to be someone's constant until she handed me that vision like a mirror I didn't know. We talked a while longer. Nothing big. She told me about a garden she used to have, peonies and basil and tomatoes that never quite ripened. I told her about a road trip I'd taken after college with a friend I'd lost touch with. It wasn't what we said that mattered. It was that we said it to each other. When it was time to leave, I stood slowly. Neither of us made a move to break the moment. She walked me to the door. No hug this time. Shh. Just a glance that lingered an extra second. A shared recognition of something deepening, not forced, not rushed, just becoming. I stepped out into the cool air, the rain having slowed to a mist, and I realized something as I walked to my car. This wasn't just her rediscovering herself. It was me too. I had gone into that house weeks ago expecting nothing. No connection, no spark, no change. And now, I wasn't sure who I'd been before I met her. It had been nearly 5 weeks since she asked me that first question, the one that had lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs and refused to leave. "Do you think 52 is too old for love?" It replayed in quiet moments when I was driving at night, when I was brushing my teeth, when I passed older couples on park benches, and wondered about the versions of themselves that had been afraid to begin again. I didn't have an answer then, but now standing in her kitchen on a cold Thursday evening, I was starting to believe the question itself wasn't really about age. It was about permission. It's a kind people forget they're allowed to give themselves. After life has taken more than it's returned, she hadn't asked me to come that day. I'd offered. I was nearby and picked up a few things, milk, eggs, her favorite granola, and texted her just before showing up. She didn't hesitate, just said doors open. I stepped inside to find her sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by papers and folders, an old shoebox turned on its side beside her. She looked up, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, and gave me the kind of smile that people reserve for quiet relief. Not joy, not surprise. Just a soft thank you written across the face. "I started going through old things," she said, gesturing to the mess around her. "Didn't mean to. It just ... happened." She motioned toward a stack of handwritten letters. "These are from a version of me I barely recognize. I don't know whether to laugh at her or hug her." I sat down across from her, careful not to crush a stack of photos that looked like they'd been untouched for years. The air was filled with that strange, specific feeling that only comes when memory is being unearthed, not for nostalgia, but for reckoning. She passed me a letter, folded neatly, dated almost 20 years earlier. It was in her handwriting, tight, graceful, full of youthful certainty. She didn't ask me to read it aloud, just handed it to me and looked away, as if what mattered wasn't the words, but my presence. The letter was addressed to her husband. Back when they were still married, before things fell apart. It spoke of simple things: a Sunday morning spent gardening, fight about dinner guests, a dream she'd had about moving to the coast. It wasn't dramatic or poetic. It was real. And in its simplicity, it hurt. It's not because of what was lost, but because of how much was once possible. I used to write letters to him like that and never send them, she said, her voice soft but even. It made me feel like I was still trying, even when we'd stopped talking. I didn't interrupt. I let her sit with it. She gathered a few more and tucked them back into the box. Then she looked up at me and said something I hadn't expected. Do you think people get used to loneliness? Like, ... they stop noticing it's there? I thought about that for a long second, then nodded. I think they get so good at managing it that they convince themselves it's peace. She didn't speak, but I saw the truth of that answer settle in her posture. Like she'd been holding her breath without realizing it, and was finally letting it out. Later, after the papers were packed away and the shoebox returned to its spot under the old cedar chest, we sat on the couch again. This time our shoulders touched, not on purpose maybe, but not by accident either. The television was on, but muted. Some black and white movie played while the room fell into a kind of stillness that didn't demand conversation. I glanced at her once, just briefly, and saw that her eyes were closed, her breathing slow, not asleep. Just resting, trusting. She looked softer in that moment than I'd ever seen her. Not because of the lighting or the quiet, but because something in her was no longer braced for impact. Like she'd let go of waiting for the next emotional ambush and started leaning into what was real, right in front of her. I didn't want to leave that night. But I also knew the weight of staying too long, of overstaying your welcome before you've earned the next step. When I stood up, she looked at me, blinked once, and said, "You feel like something I forgot I was allowed to want." It was the kind of line that could have shattered the air between us if it had been said too soon. But now it just clarified what was already there. A presence, a bond. Not quite romantic. Not yet. But moving steadily in that direction, like a tide that had made up its mind. On my drive home, the city lights looked different. Softer. I rolled the window down despite the cold and let the night air wake me up. I felt something rising in my chest, not excitement, not even hope, just a kind of deep, calm awareness that I was part of something unfolding. I was standing beside a woman who wasn't asking me to fix her or prove anything or even define what we were. She was just asking me to stay long enough to matter. And I realized then that the real question she'd asked weeks ago, the one about age and love, was never about romance. It was about visibility. She wanted to know if someone could still look at her at 52, with all her past and her questions and her unfinished edges, and see her, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a woman someone used to love, but as someone worth choosing now, and the quiet truth settling in my chest. Had I started noticing the little things, noticing them without trying? Like how she always had a soft playlist of music humming in the background, not loud, never distracting, but just enough to fill the corners of her house. Or how she folded the dish towel after drying a plate like she was tucking it in for the night. Or the way she lit one small candle in the living room around dusk, not for the scent or for show, but for the simple ritual of it. These weren't the kinds of things people did to impress someone. They were the things people did when they'd been alone long enough to make their space speak back to them. And somewhere along the line, I'd become part of that space, not as a guest, not even as a visitor, but as something more rooted, like a familiar rhythm, returning week after week. It had become a rhythm too. Sundays were ours. It's not officially, not by agreement, but through repetition. I'd bring something small bread, a flower, a new type of tiand. She'd pretend not to make a fuss while rearranging a spot on the table for it like it belonged. We never called them dates, but they felt like them. The long, slow kind, where there's no pressure to impress, just two people unfolding, quietly in each other's presence. That Sunday afternoon, the sky was clouded over, soft gray stretching to every edge of the horizon. Her house was warm as always, fire glowing low in the corner, that same familiar jazz dancing lightly from the speakers in the kitchen. She wore a soft green cardigan this time, sleeves too long, hands occasionally pulling the cuffs over her fingers. I could tell from the way she greeted me that something in her was quieter than usual. Not sad, not upset, just inward. Like her thoughts were still lingering in some place I hadn't followed her to yet. We sat on the couch with tea, shoulder to shoulder, blanket pulled across our laps more out of habit than necessity. She held her mug with both hands and stared into it for a long time before speaking. When she finally did, it was with that kind of honesty that only comes from sitting with your thoughts long enough that you can no longer pretend they're just passing through. I looked at myself in the mirror this morning, she said, and I didn't recognize her. She didn't say it dramatically. It wasn't a cry for reassurance. It was observation, raw and simple. It wasn't the wrinkles or the gray. I've made peace with those. It was something in the eyes, like the part of me that used to dream, had gone quiet. Like I was looking at a woman waiting for permission to want again. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. I let her words stretch across the room and settle into the walls because they weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be witnessed. She turned toward me slightly, her gaze soft but unflinching. Do you ever feel like you're living beside your life instead of in it? I nodded slowly, because I knew that feeling too well. Like watching yourself through glass, going through the motions, saying the right things, but never quite stepping into the warmth of your own experience. I used to think love was supposed to knock the wind out of you, she said. Grand gestures, passion, urgency. But now I think I'd settle for stillness, for being chosen not loudly, but daily. That was the moment I knew. Not that I wanted her. I already knew that. But that I was afraid to disrupt what we had with the gravity of naming it, because names come with expectations, and expectations have a habit of tipping fragile things into chaos. But in that moment, sitting beside her, as the tea cooled and the afternoon drifted toward evening, I also realized something else. This wasn't fragile. It was solid. Grown from patience, from attention, from every moment we didn't rush. So I stayed. Longer than usual, long enough that dinner came and went, and neither of us suggested food. Long enough that we both stopped pretending we weren't leaning into each other now. My arm resting against hers, her leg tucked slightly closer. We weren't making a move. We were just existing in the kind of closeness that doesn't demand touch to be intimate. At one point, she reached over and placed her hand on my knee. Not possessive, not hesitant, just ... there. And I covered it with mine, gently, like closing a book. You're not finished with, but need to rest your eyes for a moment. We didn't talk after that. We didn't have to. When I left that night, the goodbye was different. She didn't walk me to the door. She stood in the hallway, one hand resting on the frame, her silhouette outlined by the dim lamp behind her. I looked at her and nodded once, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. As I stepped into the night, the wind carried the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The streets were quiet. My car door clicked, shut louder than usual. And for the first time in years, I felt like something had opened in me. Something slow and strong and terrifying, the kind of thing that doesn't burn like fire, but warms like home. Something had shifted. Neither of us said it out loud, and I don't think either of us wanted to define it just yet. But the space between us had become denser, charged with a kind of presence that didn't ask for explanation. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It wasn't flowers and flirtation and all the loud noise people attach to love. It was slower than that, quieter, but it ran deep. Like a river under frozen ground still, but impossible to ignore. She texted me midweek for the first time, without a reason.
Ow.
No groceries, no errands. Just a short message that said, "Today felt heavy. I'm okay. Just wanted to say hi." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It's not because I didn't know what to say, but because I recognized the quiet bravery in sending it. When people have been alone long enough, even reaching out for no reason feels like risk, like asking the world to see you without an excuse. I told her I was thinking of her, that I hoped the weight lifted soon, that I'd be there Sunday. Maybe we could sit in the heaviness together if it hadn't passed by then. Sunday came. When I arrived, she didn't meet me at the door. It was already slightly open, and I stepped inside to find her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, facing away from the house. The sun was out, low and soft across the yard, casting gold light on her shoulders. I didn't say anything. Just poured 2 mugs of tea and carried them outside, setting one beside her before I sat down beside her in the second chair. She didn't speak at first, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It had become its own language. The kind of silence that holds space instead of swallowing it. After a while, she spoke quietly, like she was telling a secret to the wind. "I saw a woman in the store the other day. She must have been in her 60s, beautiful in that effortless, radiant way. Gray hair like silver thread, laugh lines that didn't try to hide. And I watched her buy a bottle of red wine and a bouquet of wildflowers, and I thought, maybe she's going home to someone who still looks at her like she's worth the wait. And it made me ache. Not from jealousy, it's just from remembering that I used to be that woman. I didn't reach for her hand. I just let her speak. I don't need to be adored, she said. I don't need a fairy tale. But I do miss being looked at like I'm still someone's possibility, not just someone's memory. There was so much truth in that, it almost knocked the air out of me, because the world doesn't talk about that part. About the loneliness that isn't loud. It's a kind that lives inside the skin. The kind that shows. Up when you catch your reflection and wonder if time has made you invisible, she turned toward me then, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. When you're young, you think love is about excitement. It's about being chosen in a crowd. But now, I think maybe it's about being seen when no one else is watching. About someone noticing you on a Tuesday afternoon. When your hair's a mess, and your heart's tired, and you're not performing anything. And in that moment, I wanted to tell her she was all of those things to me, that I saw her on every Tuesday, that I thought about her more than I wanted to admit, that she was no longer just a woman I helped, she had become a presence in my life I looked forward to, not with urgency, but with reverence. But I didn't say any of it, because some things, if said too soon, break under their own weight. Instead, I said, "You deserve to be seen like that, every day." She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was full of knowing. Later, we cooked together for the first time. She'd always insisted on doing everything. Herself before, but that night, she handed me a cutting board and said, "Chop these like they owe you money," and we both laughed like old friends. The kitchen smelled like garlic and onions and roasted rosemary. Music played low in the background, some blues record that scratched softly as it turned. Our elbows bumped. She corrected my slicing technique. I pretended to be offended. It was ordinary, and it was perfect. After dinner, we lingered at the table longer than usual. There was a candle burning now, one of those small ones in a glass jar. It made the space feel even warmer, like the moment had thickened around us. I caught her looking at me once, not with expectation, but with clarity, like she'd made peace with something inside herself. Now she was letting me see it. She stood up to clear the dishes, and I followed her into the kitchen. Didn't talk as we rinsed and dried. Then we just moved together, quietly like people who had done this for years. And maybe that's what it was becoming. Rhythm we were building, one evening at a time, till the house knew both our footsteps. After we finished, we stood in the hallway. Neither of us moved toward the door. There was no need to rush the goodbye. Then just as I was about to speak, she stepped forward and placed her hand gently against my chest-flat palm. No pressure. Just warmth. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I don't want it to go away. Neither did I, not for a second. I'm not in a hurry," I told her. "I just want to keep showing up." And she nodded. That was all. But it was everything. When I left that night, I didn't feel lighter. I felt heavier in the best possible way. Like I was carrying something meaningful now. The thread between us had strengthened, not because of what we'd said, but because of what we didn't run from. On the drive home, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of her past, not of her age, not of the uncertainty in the middle of all this, because what we had wasn't built on need. It was built on presence, on quiet consistency, on the slow, sacred act of choosing someone before the world tells. You too label it, and that kind of love. That's the kind that stays. The days were getting shorter. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, till one day I looked out the window at 5:30 in the evening and realized the sun had already slipped behind the rooftops. There was something about that creeping darkness that made things feel more urgent, not in a panicked wage, just sharper. Like time was reminding us that the moments we were collecting couldn't last forever unless we gave them a name. And yet neither of us did. We moved through those weeks like people who understood that some things, when left undefined, grow deeper. Not because of the absence of clarity, but because of the presence of care. She had started texting me more. Often. Never overbearing, never needy. Just little glimpses into her life that she wanted to share. A photo of a sunset from her back porch, a short message about a book she couldn't put down. A voice note once, her laughter caught mid-sentence because she'd dropped an entire bowl of soup and wanted to let me hear how ridiculous it sounded instead of just describing it. These were not the acts of someone trying to be noticed. Were the acts of someone slowly remembering that she deserved to be part of someone's day. I had started saving those texts. Not on purpose. Not as some romantic trophy case. But because they meant something. They reminded me that I was now a character in someone's story again. Not just a man floating between obligations and silence. They reminded me that someone was thinking of me at odd hours, not with expectation, but with intention. When I arrived at her house that Sunday, she was already waiting with the door slightly cracked and a look in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't intense. It was something simpler and maybe more profound. It was relief, like the presence of another person had started to matter more than she'd allowed herself to admit. We didn't speak much at first. We walked into the kitchen where a pot of coffee was already half full, and she handed me a mug without saying a word. There was music playing, something instrumental and slow, more background than foreground, as we moved around each other. In that familiar space, I realized how comfortable we'd become with the quiet. There was no need to fill it. We had already filled it with each other. She led me out to the back porch where a thick blanket had been thrown over to chairs, and we sat, side by side, sipping our coffee as the sky turned from dull gray to the faintest shade of blue. Air was cold but not biting. It's just enough to make you appreciate the heat of the mug in your hands. After a while, she broke the silence, not with a confession, but with a memory. I used to think I had to earn peace, she said. That I needed to be productive to deserve rest. That I had to do everything for everyone else before I could allow myself to be still. I didn't respond. I just listened. Because I knew that voice. I'd heard it inside myself too. She took a slow sip and stared out across the yard. But lately I've started to wonder if maybe peace isn't earned. Maybe it's received. Maybe it's what happens when you stop performing long enough to realize you're allowed to be loved as you are. That landed so hard it left a kind of echo in my chest. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. There are entire years that go by where we treat stillness like a luxury instead of a right. We convince ourselves that love is conditional, that affection must be earned through usefulness. And then if we're lucky, someone comes along and quietly, without agenda, just stays. Not to fix, not to rescue, but to witness. And through that witnessing, we start to remember who we were before we tried so hard to be impressive. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze move across her face. And in that moment, I saw her not as a woman rebuilding herself, but as someone who had already rebuilt quietly while no one was watching. The strength wasn't in the rebuilding. It was in her willingness to let someone into it after the walls were finally steady again. We went inside as the cold settled in, and she lit a few candles around the living room, like she always did. Small rituals that turned space into sanctuary. She didn't ask if I wanted to stay. She just made space for me. Set a second bowl on the coffee table, poured 2 glasses of wine, pressed play on an old movie we both admitted we'd never seen, but had always meant to. Halfway through the film, she rested her head lightly on my shoulder. No conversation, no checking to see if it was okay. Just gravity pulling her in the direction she trusted. And I let her stay there. Not because I wanted to escalate things, but because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for another person is to hold their weight without asking them to explain it. When the credits rolled, we didn't move. The room had gone dark except for the flicker of the candles and the soft hum of the heater kicking on. Her breathing was slow, steady, almost asleep. I thought about brushing her hair back, but didn't. Not yet. Instead, I memorized the shape of the moment, the way her hand had found mine somewhere in the middle of the second act, the way her body leaned not just into mine, but into the idea of being allowed to lean at all. Eventually, she stirred, looked up, smiled. "I'm not used to feeling safe like this," she said, barely above a whisper. "And not the kind of safe where nothing happens. It's the kind where I don't have to wonder if I'm too much." I didn't tell her she wasn't too much. I didn't list all the reasons why she deserved that safety. I just held her hand a little tighter and said, "You don't have to wonder anymore." She kissed my cheek. Nothing more. No pressure. Just the smallest gesture of gratitude, wrapped in affection. And that night, for the first time, I didn't leave right away. I stayed. Not in her bed. Not with an agenda. I stayed on the couch with her, falling asleep beside me, our hands still joined, and the quiet between us humming with a kind of certainty I hadn't felt in years. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like it had something to say, but didn't need to be heard. Inside, everything was still, and in that stillness, I realized Di hadn't just found her. I'd come home to myself. There's a certain weight to routine. Once it's no longer accidental. When familiarity becomes deliberate, and patterns that used to feel coincidental start to feel like choice. That's what it became with her. Not just the Sundays, or the text messages, or the quiet glances over coffee, but the sense that we were choosing each other week after week in small and deliberate ways. She'd stopped apologizing for inviting me in, and I'd stopped pretending I didn't want to stay longer. What we had wasn't casual, wasn't undefined anymore. It was unspoken, but it was real. By then it had grown too consistent to be anything but sacred. That following Sunday, I arrived with no groceries, no excuse. Just me. I knocked out of habit even though I knew the door would be unlocked, and sure enough, it creaked open before I could even drop my hand.
Oh.
She stood there with her reading, glasses on and a pencil tucked behind her ear, holding a folded magazine in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. She smiled, not with surprise, but with something else, something gentler, like she'd just exhaled for the first time. That day and didn't even know she'd been holding her breath. I was just reading about how relationships get harder as we age, she said as I stepped inside. Apparently our ability to compromise declines while our standards rise. She sipped her tea. I'm not sure whether that's depressing or liberating. I took off my coat and hung it on the same hook I always used. The one she never told me to use, but that I'd started using. On instinct. There were small things like that everywhere in her house now. Second coffee mug already set on the counter, a folded blanket on the couch just wide enough for two, a pair of slippers beside the door, not mine, but a size too big to be hers. Presence had taken shape. It had become furniture. She handed me the cup of tea and gestured for me to follow her into the living room. The light was soft, filtered through a linen curtain, and the room smelled faintly of rosemary and cedar wood. We sat down, almost in sync, and for a while said nothing. The silence had become part of us. It's not something we avoided, but something we relied on. And in that silence, I found myself watching her not for the first time, but maybe more closely than I had before. She was wearing a soft wool sweater that draped over one shoulder and leggings that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back, strands loose around her cheekbones. No makeup, no performance. It's just her. Unfiltered. Present, and stunning not because of her features, but because of her ease. She had reached the kind of womanhood that no longer asked for permission to be ordinary, and that made her extraordinary. She looked over at me, catching my stare, but she didn't flinch. "What?" she asked, her voice a whisper more out of comfort than caution. I shook my head and smiled. Nothing. Just thinking. What? About. I paused, then answered without hesitation. How easy this feels, and how rare that is. She took that in, didn't deflect, didn't joke. Just nodded slightly and turned back toward the window. I spent years trying to force things to feel like this, she said quietly. It's trying to make people comfortable in my space, trying to be what they needed so they'd stay. But it never worked because I never really let myself need anyone, just let myself be useful. That hit like truth wrapped in memory. I knew what she meant. I'd done it too. Worn usefulness like armor. Offered help instead of vulnerability. Built relationships where I gave everything except access to who I really was. But this, she continued, this isn't useful. This is mutual. And that's what scares me. Didn't speak. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because her honesty deserved more than quick reassurance. It deserved stillness. She leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes. It scares me because if I lose, I won't just be losing company. I'll be losing clarity. It's ... thing between us. ... It reminds me who I am. Who I've always been underneath the noise. And in that moment, I realized how deep we'd already gone. We weren't dating. We weren't labeling. But we were anchoring into each other. Tethering slowly, carefully, emotionally, and I'd never felt anything quite like it. That night, we cooked dinner together again. This time, a recipe from her mother's old notebook. She handed me the pages like they were relics, handwritten in faded ink with little notes scribbled in the margins. She never measured anything, she said with a laugh. Oh, she just felt. It drove me crazy as a kid. Now I understand it. We moved through the kitchen like people who had done this 100 times, not out of routine, but out of rhythm. I stirred while she chopped. She reached for spices while I poured wine. There was no need to ask questions, just moved in tandem. And something about that dance, that unspoken coordination, felt more intimate than anything else we could have done. After dinner, we sat at the table long after the plates were cleared, talking about nothing and everything. Childhood stories, songs we used to dance to, places we'd once dreamed of going and no longer felt the need to chase. There was something in the way she looked at me now, not probing, not nervous, but open. Like whatever walls had been left standing were now just decorative. When the evening turned late, I stood up to leave. She didn't walk me to the door this time. Instead, she stood there in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed lightly over her chest, backlit by the soft kitchen lamp. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I'm not sure where this is going, but I know I don't want it to stop. Neither did I." I nodded. "We'll figure it out." She smiled. That small, knowing smile that had become a signature between us. No rush. And there wasn't, because what we were building didn't need rushing, didn't need labels. It needed room and time and presence. And we had all of those things now. There comes a moment in any connection, if it's real, where the emotional weight becomes undeniable. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. It's no longer something you wonder about. Something you feel in the way your body settles differently in their space. The way your breath evens out around them. The way the air takes on a new temperature when they're close. And that's where we were now. I could feel her even when she wasn't in the room. I'd walk into her house and sense her mood before she said a word. Some days she moved like light, warm and graceful, and other days like fog, quiet, slow. Harder to hold, but always real, always present. That next Sunday, I arrived to find the house filled with a smell I hadn't known before. Not food. Something older, deeper. The kind of scent that makes you pause the second you step through the door. I followed it into the living room and found her standing by an old cedar chest, its lid wide open. With blankets and sweaters and what looked like decades of stories folded inside, she was barefoot, wearing jeans and a thin, long-sleeved shirt. Her hair pulled up casually, like she'd been in the middle of something and forgot I was coming. She didn't greet me with a smile this time. She just looked up, eyes soft, and said, "I wanted to find something. I wasn't sure what, so I opened this." Her hand hovered above the edge of the chest like she was afraid to reach in too far, like the memories inside might bite. It's strange, isn't it? How objects hold weight. You think you've let something go, and then you find the sweater they used to wear, or the book they left a note in, and suddenly, It's like the air thickens. I didn't say anything. I just stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, and sat down beside the chest. She pulled out a small quilt hand-stitched, the edges frayed, fabric worn soft from years of use. She unfolded it slowly, and I could see her hands trembling just slightly. Not from sadness. From memory. My grandmother made this, she said. When I got married, she told me it would be the first layer of the life I'd build. She laughed once, quietly, and I believed her. I thought that was how it worked. You get the gift, you follow the plan, and everything builds from there. She draped the quilt across her lap and sat down beside me on the floor. We sat there, side by side, with nothing but the sound of the house creaking around us and the soft hum of the heater kicking on again. It was a different kind of intimacy that day, not flirtation, not affection, just the slow merging of histories. She wasn't just sharing space with me anymore, she was sharing time. She reached into the chest again and pulled out an old envelope. Inside were a few photos, the corners curled and color faded. One showed her standing beside a man who must have been her husband, both of them younger, smiling, eyes full of a future they hadn't yet lived. She stared at it for a long moment, then handed it to me. I don't miss the marriage, she said, but I miss the version of me that believed. In it, I miss the part of me that looked at that camera and thought love would be enough. I held the photo gently. It wasn't my place to interpret it, only to witness it. And I think she appreciated that I didn't ask questions. I just listened, just stayed. She put the photo back in the envelope and set it aside. Then she looked at me, really looked like she was trying to memorize my face without saying why. I don't know what we are, she said after a while, and I don't need it defined. But I need you to know something. I don't do this. I don't let people this close. Not anymore. I keep waiting for the part where it gets too hard and I pull back, but I haven't yet. That terrifies me. I nodded, not because I was afraid, but because I understood letting someone in after you've rebuilt your life is a different kind of risk. It's not about fear of rejection. It's about fear of dismantling the peace you fought like hell to earn. She'd built something stable in her solitude, and it was the first thing in years to walk into it without knocking everything over. But still presence is disruption, even when it's gentle. I'm not here to take anything from you, I said. And I'm not waiting for this to become something else. I just want to keep being here, however I can be. Her shoulders softened then, just slightly, like my words had unclenched something in her chest. We sat there for a long while, legs crossed, the quilt between us, the chest still open beside us like a portal. And even though nothing was said, for the next 10 minutes, everything was being decided in that silence. This wasn't casual. This wasn't undefined. This was something growing roots in real time. Eventually, we stood up, packed everything back into the cedar chest, and closed the lid together. It clicked shut with a soft finality, like a chapter closed not on the past, but on the fear that revisiting it meant regression. She wasn't falling backward. She was clearing space. That night, we didn't sit on the couch. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, knees bent, sharing a blanket and the last of a bottle of red wine. The music had stopped by then. The house had fallen into that kind of stillness that only comes when everything important has already been said. She leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed, not tired, but settled. I didn't know how much. I needed this, she whispered. I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't need to, because I felt the same way. By the time the next weekend came around, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the subtle way. Routines evolve when feelings catch up to them. I didn't knock this time. The door was unlocked, just like it always was now, and I let myself in like I had 100 times before. But this time, there was a difference. A weightlessness. Quiet welcome I didn't need to hear out loud to believe. Her house didn't just feel like a familiar place anymore. It felt like a place that expected me. Not with obligation, but with trust. I found her in the kitchen, hair wet from a recent shower, wearing an oversized sweatshirt and fuzzy socks. She was dancing softly, aimlessly swaying more than moving, a wooden spoon in one hand as she stirred something on the stove. There was music playing, some old soul track, with a gentle rhythm and warm vocals that wrapped around the room like a blanket. She didn't see me right away, and I didn't interrupt. I stood there in the doorway and watched her. Watched the way her body moved like no one was watching. And it hit me just how rare that is, to witness someone in their own ease, in their own rhythm, without performance. Eventually she turned, saw me, and smiled, not startled, not embarrassed. Just happy I was there. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. She just kept stirring the pot on the stove and motioned. For me to sit at the counter like this was the most natural thing in the world. And honestly, by that point, it was. We ate together at the counter. Bowls warm in our hands, shoulders close, laughter coming easily. She told me about a dream she had the night before, where we were both much younger, riding bikes down a coastal road, the wind pushing us faster than we could pedal. She said she woke up with that kind of ache you get when a dream feels better than reality. I didn't know how to respond to that, not because it scared me, but because I felt the same thing. This, whatever this was, had become so consistent, so emotionally present, that the lines between comfort and closeness had already blurred. After dinner, we moved to the living room, and without speaking, she pulled the quilt, the same one her grandmother made from the cedar chest, and wrapped it around us both. It wasn't cold. It was just something to do with our hands. Something that made the silence feel like home. We sat like that for what felt like hours. Number television, no distractions, just the occasional clink of her teacup on the saucer and the soft sound of the wind tapping against the windows. At one point, her head found its place on my shoulder, and my hand, without thinking, rested gently on her knee. There was no escalation, no forward movement. Just closeness. Just two people who had built something so quietly over time that now it felt immovable. Then she spoke softly, but with that sharp kind of clarity that makes you sit up straighter without realizing it. I think I've already fallen for you. She said it like a fact, like she was naming something that had been true for weeks and was only just now making it audible. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just kept her gaze forward, fingers tracing the edge of the mug in her lap, her voice steady but stripped of armor. I felt my heart thump once hard, real then settle, because I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear it until I did. She took a breath and continued, and that scares me, because I wasn't planning on any of this. Thought I was too far past it. Too old, too tired, too rebuilt. Here we are, and it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not even romantic in the traditional sense, but it's real. It's here. And I don't want to ignore it anymore. I didn't speak right away, because nothing kills a sacred moment faster than rushing to label it. So instead, I tightened the blanket around us, leaned in a little closer, and let my presence speak louder than any sentence could. I wanted her to know I was there. It's not just physically. I was in it. With her. Ack! All the way. Eventually, I said, I felt it too. I didn't know if I should name it. I didn't want to disrupt the quiet we've built, but yes, same. All of it. She nodded, and something in her face softened again, like a muscle she'd been holding tense for years had finally relaxed. That was the moment everything changed. In the external world, not in any grand gesture, but internally. We were no longer dancing around something unnamed. We had stepped into it. Finally. Fully. She reached over and placed her hand on mine, fingers lacing with mine, and that touch felt heavier than anything that had come before it. It's not in burden, in depth, in meaning. We sat like that, hand in hand. Blanket wrapped around us. The house dim and quiet and full of everything we hadn't said out loud until now. When I left that night, I stood at the door a little longer than usual. She stood beside me, still barefoot, arms folded against her chest, and we didn't say much. There was no need. We'd already said everything that mattered. I kissed her on the forehead before I walked out, not to prove anything, not to advance the relationship, but because it felt like the right thing to do, because she had given me something sacred, and I wanted her to know it wasn't taken lightly. The walk to the car was quiet. The street empty, sky clear. And as I slid into the driver's seat, I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not butterflies, not excitement. Something steadier, certainty that what we had wasn't temporary, that I wasn't a chapter in her life, that maybe we were both building something worth finishing. The next few days were oddly quiet, and not in a way that felt wrong or unsettling, just different. There was no avalanche of texts, no sudden change in our rhythm, but under the surface, something had undeniably shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't scream, but hums. That quietly rearranges the furniture inside you without ever announcing itself. I went about my week like normal deliveries, errands, early mornings, but everything seemed to move around a center that now had her in it. It's not in a way that distracted me, in a way that grounded me. She was the voice I imagined reacting to my stories, the presence I felt in silence, the face I saw when something beautiful happened and had no one else to share it with. It's strange how quickly we adapt to feeling seen. For years, I had gotten used to existing in the margins essential, maybe in function, but invisible in meaning. But now, my days felt tethered to something that mattered. Not because it was dramatic or passionate or even clearly defined, because it was real. And real, I was beginning to understand, doesn't always come wrapped in fireworks. It shows up like a mug left out for you in someone else's kitchen, or a text that just says, "Drive safe," or a glance across the room that doesn't ask for anything but still gives you everything. When Sunday arrived again, I didn't bring flowers. I didn't bring food. I brought myself. Fully, without distraction. Without the mask of small talk or errands or lighthearted gestures to fill the space. She opened the door and I could tell immediately she was tired. Not exhausted, not drained, just ... emotionally full. Her eyes were softer, shoulders lower. Like someone who'd been carrying a realization around all week and was still unsure what to do with it. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let me in, the way she always had. But even that small act felt heavier now, more deliberate. We didn't go to the kitchen. We didn't sit in the living room. Instead, she led me outside to the back porch, where the air was cool and the sky was just beginning to slip into that pale orange of early evening. The trees were nearly bare now. The breeze carried with it the smell of firewood and something else earthy, nostalgic, like change itself had a scent. She sat on the old bench, pulled the blanket over her lap, and stared out across the yard. I sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she'd only have to lean slightly if she wanted to rest her weight against me. She spoke after a long pause. "You ever feel like your life is made up of versions of you that never got to finish becoming?" I didn't answer right away, because I knew exactly what she meant, because I didn't want to interrupt her rhythm. She went on, voice slow. Steady, deliberate. There was the version of me that wanted to travel the world after college. The one that said she'd never settle. The one that thought love meant fireworks and passion and late-night phone calls that lasted till dawn. And then there was the version that became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's employee. All of those women lived inside me. Now I'm trying to figure out which of them gets to speak again. I looked at her hands folded in her lap, thumbs brushing together like she was still working out the rest of the sentence in silence. And I realized this was the work no one ever talks about, the emotional archaeology of middle life. When the world stops clapping for your milestones and starts watching to see whether you'll disappear quietly or find a way to begin again. She turned to face me then. And the look in her eyes was different than before. Not vulnerable, not even afraid. It was something harder to name, something more human. She said, "I'm scared that if I love you fully, I'll lose myself again, that I'll forget how to be alone, that I'll start shrinking again just to be chosen." That hit me. Like a punch I saw coming but couldn't block because it was honest. And because it was fair? I nodded, then said slowly, "You don't have to shrink for me. You don't even have to make space for me. I want to fit where you already are, not take anything from you, not rearrange your piece. Just be here. With you." She didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. The way she exhaled told me everything. Like her lungs had been holding that fear in for too long and finally decided to let it go. We sat in that understanding for a while. Let the wind do the talking. Let the trees shed what they no longer needed while we held on to what we did. And eventually she leaned her head on my shoulder, not as a romantic gesture, but as a surrender. The quiet kind. The kind that says, "I'm still scared, but I'm not running anymore." That night, we didn't talk about the future. We didn't plan anything. Didn't need to. What we had wasn't on a timeline. It didn't require momentum to prove it was real. It was building. Slowly, layer by layer, like stone being shaped by water. Gentle, steady, permanent. When I left, she walked me to the door. Stood barefoot on the mat, like she always did. But this time, when I turned to go, she reached out, took my hand, and held it for a moment longer. Her thumb brushed mine once. And then she let go, not out of reluctance, but out of trust. Driving home that night, I didn't listen to music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove in silence, windows down, letting the cold night air press against my face like a reminder. You're alive in something new now. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, too. About the version of myself that had been waiting patiently in the wings. The one that didn't need attention or validation, but needed to matter to someone again. And finally, quietly, I did. There's a moment in every growing relationship, spoken or unspoken, when the other person starts to occupy not just your time, but your rhythm. You find yourself hearing their voice in decisions they're not present. 4. You start looking at things the way they might look at them. You begin to carry their influence like a layer of clothing you didn't realize you'd put on. That was happening to me now, quietly but consistently. And the strangest part? I wasn't resisting it. I wasn't analyzing or bracing or holding back. I was letting it happen. Not because I was swept away by love in the poetic sense, but because whatever this was between me and her had become a space where I didn't have to shrink, perform, or explain myself. And that kind of space invites transformation without demand. The next week felt different. I worked the same schedule, ran the same routes, saw the same faces at pickup counters and on front porches. But I moved through it with a different kind of presence. I was more patient, more aware. I noticed the way the sun came through the windshield at different times of day. I found myself humming songs under my breath I hadn't thought about in years. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't distracted. It was like something had quietly unclenched inside me, and I knew exactly where it had come from. Her, not as a savior, not as an answer, but as a mirror. She reflected back the version of me that had been waiting for someone to make space for him again by the time Sunday arrived. I didn't even think about whether I'd be seeing her. It was already assumed. I showed up around 5, and the porch light was already on. She met me at the door with wet hands and flour on her cheek, laughing as she wiped them on her apron. "You're early," she said, but there was no teasing in her tone. Just that familiar warmth that had slowly become my favorite sound. I stepped inside, and the house smelled like home. Not just her home. Ours. The kitchen was filled with the scent of garlic and thyme, and something baking low in the oven that made the air thick and comforting. She moved around the room with purpose, barefoot again, her hair twisted up in that effortless way she always wore it when she was focused. We didn't make a big deal out of the evening. That was the beauty of it. We didn't need to. There were no plans, no agenda, just presence. She handed me a glass of wine, pointed to the salad she hadn't finished, and said, "You know what to do." And I did. I washed my hands, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. Not as a guest, not as a helper, but as someone who belonged there. Maybe that's the deepest kind of intimacy. The kind where contribution doesn't feel like obligation, but like instinct. After dinner, we moved to the living room without speaking. She grabbed the blanket from the back of the couch, and we settled into our usual place, shoulders touching, legs stretched out, her hand slipping easily into mine like it had always known the shape of it. The fire crackled softly. The dishes could wait. The world outside could wait. For now, this was all there was, and it was enough. She rested her head on my chest, her breathing slow and steady, and I could feel her entire body relax in stages, like a muscle uncoiling. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. I used to believe love was supposed to fix you. Once you found the right person, all the broken parts would magically reassemble. But now, I think maybe love just gives you the courage to sit with your brokenness without shame. That landed hard, not because it was a new idea, because it came from someone who had lived it, survived it, built from it. And now, she was letting me see the scaffolding that still held some of those pieces in place. She shifted slightly, looking up at me, and continued, I'm not trying to be whole for you. I don't expect you to feel anything. But for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to hide the cracks. I didn't respond, not with words. I just squeezed her hand a little tighter and kissed the top of her head gently, slowly, not to escalate, just to affirm, to say, I see you. I'm still here that night. Something else changed. Not dramatically, but deeply. She fell asleep. Beside me on the couch, her breath warm against my chest, her fingers still loosely curled in mine, and I didn't move. I didn't shift to get more comfortable. I just stayed still, present, holding her weight not as a burden, but as an honor. Eventually, around midnight, I gently carried her to bed. She stirred as I lifted her, but didn't speak. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, caught mine, and closed again with a small smile. I tucked the blanket around her, stood there for a long minute, then turned off the lamp and pulled the door nearly shut. I slept on the couch that night, not because I was afraid, not because there were lines I didn't want to cross, but because what we had deserved patience, respect, and I didn't want anything, not even desire, to rush what was already unfolding so perfectly on its own timeline in the morning. I woke to the sound of a kettle boiling and her humming in. The kitchen. I stretched, rubbed my eyes, and followed the smell of coffee. She stood by the window, wrapped in a robe, her hair still messy, her expression soft and peaceful. She turned as I entered, handed me a mug, and said, You stayed. It wasn't a question, it was a thank you. I nodded. Of course, we didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The silence between us had evolved from comfort into communion. It said more than words could. It said, I'm here. I see you. Let's keep going. And in that moment, drinking coffee in her kitchen in the early morning light, I realized something simple and undeniable. We weren't falling in love. We were. Already there, it was strange how ordinary it all began to feel. Not in the sense of dullness or routine, but in that rare kind of way where something once unthinkable becomes natural. The way a stray dog becomes part of the family without anyone saying it out loud. Or how a spare key finds its permanent place on a hook by the door. That was us now. Not defined by any declaration, not framed by titles or timelines, but marked by quiet participation. I didn't think about whether I belonged there anymore. I just did. And what surprised me most was that she had stopped questioning it. 2. That Tuesday morning, I dropped off a small potted herb plant on her porch. No note, no explanation. Just something I'd seen at the market that reminded me of the smell. In her kitchen, when she cooked rosemary maybe, or sage, I wasn't sure. I just knew it felt like her. And later that day, she texted me a photo of it already nestled into her windowsill, sunlight painting half its leaves gold. One word followed. The image, perfect. It made my chest tighten. Not because it was romantic, but because it was received. There was something sacred about being allowed into someone's life at the level of the mundane. The grocery list, the broken drawer, the unread mail stacked neatly on the counter. We weren't wrapped in constant, deep conversations anymore. Sometimes we sat in silence while she paid bills, and I scrolled through my phone. Sometimes I helped her carry out the recycling or replace a light bulb. These weren't romantic gestures, they were acts of integration. Of daily life made softer by company. And it hit me one night while folding laundry beside her on the couch. I wasn't part of her world because she needed help. I was part of it because she liked having me there. That, I think, is a kind of love that gets so overlooked. Choosing each other not out of necessity, but out of joy. That weekend, we took a short drive to a park just outside town. She said she needed air. movement. "I haven't walked that trail in years," she'd said. "It used to be my favorite." So we went. No big plans, no packed lunch. Just 2 reusable water bottles and jackets tied around our waists as the afternoon warmed. The trail wound gently along the edge of a lake, the water quiet and glassy, reflecting a sky so blue it looked almost artificial. She walked slower than I expected at first, not because she was tired, but because she was present. Her eyes lingered on everything. A bird landing on a branch, a squirrel darting across the path, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. She touched the bark of trees as we passed them, as though reacquainting herself with a forgotten language. We talked some, but not much. It's a kind of talk that floats between shared glances and small smiles. She told me about a birthday she once spent here with her kids when they were young, about how they used to race along the path and feed ducks by the water. Her voice caught when she said it, not out of grief, but because memory always stings a little when it comes uninvited. I didn't offer comfort. I just reached for her hand and held it loosely. She let it stay there the rest of the walk. Afterward, we sat on a bench overlooking the lake. She pulled her jacket on, tucked her legs up beneath her, and leaned into me. Her head rested against my shoulder, and I felt her sigh more than I heard it. That kind of deep exhale that only comes after you've let something heavy go, she whispered then, her voice nearly lost to the wind. I didn't think I'd ever have this again. Not just the affection, but the ease. To not having to explain everything. The being understood before I speak. I wanted to tell her that I felt the same. I had spent years convincing myself this kind of quiet belonging wasn't meant for me, but the moment didn't need my words. It needed my silence. So I let it stretch between us, warm and full and unrushed. Later that night, back at her house, she made soup. Simple one: vegetables, lentils, whatever herbs she had on hand. It filled the kitchen with steam and familiarity. I sat at the counter sipping wine and watching her move, and it struck me how much we had changed, or maybe grown, since the beginning. There was no longer any carefulness in our proximity, no hesitation in our tasks. The house no longer braced for my presence. It welcomed it. She no longer watched her words. She just spoke. I no longer tried to impress her. I just stayed. Over dinner, we laughed about something neither of us could now remember. Something small. Maybe the way she'd dropped a spoon. Maybe the strange way I pronounced turmeric. It didn't matter. What mattered was how easy it was now to find joy in the ordinary. How rare it was to find someone who didn't need everything to be profound in order to feel fulfilled. When the dishes were done and the house quieted down, she stepped into the hallway, disappeared for a moment, and returned with an old photo. "Album? I want to show you something," she said, already flipping through the pages as she sat beside me on the couch. What followed wasn't a tour of her past meant to impress me. It was something else entirely. Showed me her awkward teenage years, her first apartment, pictures of her kids at various ages, their messy rooms, their Halloween costumes. She pointed out who had taken each photo. She told me what she'd been thinking at the time, even if no one else knew. These weren't curated memories, they were real ones. And in sharing them, she wasn't just opening a book. She was opening a door. By the time we reached the last page, the room was dim. Only the lamp beside the couch gave off any light. She looked over at me, her fingers still resting on the corner of the page, and she said, "You're part of this now." "You know that, right?" I nodded. Not because I felt like I should, but because I knew it was true, and in that moment, nothing else needed to be said. The days that followed started folding in on each other, not in a rushed or chaotic way, but more like pages being gently turned. You don't always notice the exact line where one ends and another begins. That's how it was with us. What began as weekly visits and small gestures had become something stitched into the fabric of daily life. I found myself thinking less about what we were and more about how. I was with her, grounded, seen, unrushed, the kind of feeling that settles into your bones and makes you start reconsidering what stability really means. Not structure, not predictability, but emotional rhythm. And we had it now. One Thursday afternoon, I found myself near her neighborhood between jobs and without thinking stopped by. I hadn't texted ahead. I didn't bring anything. I wasn't even sure if she'd be home. but something about the idea of being near her without stopping in felt wrong. Her car was in the driveway, so I knocked. She answered the door in a loose sweater and socks, glasses perched low on her nose, and a pencil tucked in her hair like she'd been writing something important, but forgot the time. Her face lit up, not surprised, just warmly interrupted, and she stepped aside to let me in without question. No hesitation. No need for explanation. That, to me, was the real arrival. Not a first kiss, not a big date. Walking through someone's door and knowing your presence didn't require a reason inside. The house felt quieter than usual, not empty, just resting. There was no music playing, no kettle whistling, no scent of food or candles. She led me to the living room, where a half-finished crossword lay across the arm of the couch. And I realized I had never seen her doing nothing. She was always hosting in some way, offering tea, cooking, adjusting lighting. But this time, she simply sat beside me and pulled her knees to her chest like she was glad for the company, but too tired to perform. And I loved her more in that moment than I ever had, because I could tell she felt safe enough to be unpolished. We sat there saying nothing for longer than I would have believed possible just a few months ago. At one point, she leaned her head back against the cushion and exhaled so deeply it felt like a kind of unspoken confession. That she didn't need anything from me in that moment, but wanted me there anyway. Eventually, she reached over and rested her hand on my leg, not looking at me, not waiting for a reaction, just letting herself make contact. It wasn't romantic, it was sacred. That's what we had now, a kind of tenderness that didn't announce itself but always knew when. To arrive, when I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door, and instead of saying goodbye, she asked, "What are you doing this weekend?" I shrugged. Told her I hadn't thought that far ahead. She smiled. "Come by Saturday. Might need your help rearranging some things in the guest room." I knew what that meant, even if she didn't say it. Not just help lifting furniture or moving boxes. She was making room, quietly, deliberately for me. For us, Saturday came, and I showed up with sleeves rolled and no questions asked. She was already halfway through pulling books off a shelf when I arrived. The guest room was small-eased, mostly for storage and the occasional overnight visit from her sister. But she had decided it needed to become something more. A reading space, she said. Maybe a room where I write again. I smiled, knowing she hadn't written in years, not since before her marriage ended. Not since she stopped trusting her own voice. We moved shelves, vacuumed corners, wiped windows that hadn't been touched in too long. She sat on the floor, sorting books into piles keep, donate. Reread and I stayed beside her, passing her volumes one by one, not rushing, just present. Occasionally we'd stop to read a sentence aloud, or laugh at a note scribbled in the margins. Time stretched out that way, measured not by the clock, but by the shared attention of two people creating something together. After hours of shifting and sorting, she stood in the middle of the room and looked around, hands on hips, expression unreadable. "It doesn't look that different," she said, "but it feels different." And she was right. The room still held the same furniture, the same books, the same lamp in the corner, but now it also held our fingerprints, our breath, our rhythm. We ordered takeout and sat on the floor eating straight from the containers, chopsticks clicking softly between us. Her hair was messy, her sweatshirt stained, and I couldn't imagine anything more beautiful. There's something deeply intimate about shared exhaustion. Not the kind born from drama or confrontation, but the tiredness that comes after doing something mundane and necessary together. That's where real connection lives. In the small, unremarkable moments that add up to a life. After dinner, she pulled me toward the living room. But instead of collapsing on the couch, she stopped at the hallway. "Stay tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't. Laced with seduction or layered with implication, was simple, clear. A sentence spoken from the center of trust. And I didn't hesitate. We brushed our teeth together like we'd done it 100 times before, slipped into bed like it was always waiting for us. She curled into my chest and let out a sigh that vibrated against my ribs. I ran my hand down her back in slow, quiet patterns. And we fell asleep that way, no words, no plans, no need for anything but presence. In the middle of the night, I woke briefly to find her hand still wrapped around mine under the sheets. I stared at the ceiling for a while, feeling the weight of that gesture settle into me. This wasn't new love anymore. It wasn't butterflies or first kisses or sparks. It was something steadier. It's a kind of love that shows up without fanfare. The kind that rearranges your concept of home until a person becomes the address. That morning, we moved slowly, made coffee, sat at the table in our pajamas, read parts of the newspaper to each other. And somewhere between sips, she looked up and said, "You're the only part of my life that doesn't feel like work." I didn't know what to say, not because I didn't agree, but because the truth of it struck something deep in me. So I reached across the table, took her hand in mine, and held it. We didn't have a plan. We didn't need one. We had what mattered. And that was enough. There's a point in love, if you're lucky, where the question isn't, are we together? But how much of my life has already shifted to include you without me realizing it? It's what the days began to feel. Like, not some new chapter being drafted, but the realization that we'd been living in it for a while. She and I weren't growing toward something anymore. We were inside it. It was in the shared silence, the grocery receipts that now reflected both our habits, the familiar way I could find the tea bags in her kitchen without asking. It was in the moments she didn't flinch when I reached for her hand, and the way she started asking what my week looked like before planning hers. These were not declarations. These were integrations. The Monday after I stayed over, I caught myself reaching for my phone first thing in the morning just to see if she'd texted, not because I needed anything, not because I had a question or a plan, just to feel her presence at the start of the day. She had texted me first just a single sentence, "Still feels like you're here." And that was enough to reorient my entire day. She didn't have to ask for attention. She already had it. I carried her into my errands, my conversations, my idle thoughts. Not like a distraction, but like a constant background hum of someone who'd moved from the edges of my life to the center without making a sound. Later that week, she invited me to meet her sister. It wasn't a big gesture. No dinner, no fanfare. Her sister was in town and they were having lunch. She said it casually, as though I'd been expected all along. "You should come," she said, not as a test, but as a truth. And while it hit me a little harder than I expected, this idea of stepping further into her world, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, because she had invited me into her life one room at a time, and I wasn't about to stop walking through the doors. Her sister was kind, sharp, and observant in the way people are when they care deeply but don't waste time with small talk. We met at a local cafe, one of those quiet spots tucked behind a bookstore, where the tables were close together and the lighting made everyone look 10% softer. The conversation was easy. Nothing probing, nothing awkward. Her sister asked questions, not like an investigator, more like someone who wanted to make sure I understood what I was holding. She didn't ask me to prove anything. She just wanted to see if I showed up the same way in public as I did in private. And by the end of lunch, when her sister reached across the table and gave my hand a quick, proving squeeze, I knew I had passed whatever invisible test had been set. On the way back to her place, we walked slowly, even though the air had that early winter bite. She was quiet at first, but it wasn't tense. It was the kind of quiet that comes from thinking, not worrying. When we reached her porch, she stopped and turned toward me, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "I used to dread introducing people to my family," she said, "because it always felt like performance. It's like I had to prepare both sides for disappointment. But today, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel like I was explaining you. I felt like I was introducing someone they were already supposed to meet." That moment landed deeper than I expected. It's not because it was romantic, but because it was recognition. Being seen not just by her, but by the people who mattered to her. That's the quiet threshold where love moves from something shared between two people to something witnessed by the world around them. The next few days blurred together in the best kind of way. I was there more often, not living there, not officially. But I had a toothbrush in her bathroom and a drawer in her dresser. She'd started folding my clothes into her laundry without asking. It wasn't about convenience. It was about presence. Her house felt less like a stop and more like a place my day naturally ended. We weren't making announcements to anyone, but we were forming a life, not a fantasy. A real, lived-in life, one chore, one shared meal, one sleepy Sunday morning at a time. Then came the call. It was Friday afternoon. I was between deliveries when my phone buzzed, and I saw her name. When I answered, her voice was calm, but it had that underlying current you learn to hear after enough time with someone. It trembled, too quiet to name, but too real to ignore. She told me her ex-husband had called, that he was moving back to town, that he wanted to see the kids, that he'd asked if they could talk. I listened, letting the words fall where they needed. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't looking for advice. She just needed to say it aloud. After a pause, she said, "It didn't shake me the way I thought it would. But it did shake something. Not because I want him back at ships. Long gone. But because it reminded me how much I've changed. How much quieter I've become inside. How little I tolerate noise now." I understood what she meant. We all carry echoes of people we once gave too much of ourselves to. And sometimes all it takes is a voicemail to reopen rooms we thought we'd boarded up. I didn't press her. I didn't offer cliches about closure or strength. I just said, "I'm here." Because sometimes that's all love needs to say. Not to fix, not to solve, but to anchor. That night, she didn't want to talk. She just wanted to be. I came over anyway, let myself in. Found her in bed, half asleep, her eyes already adjusting to the idea that everything would be okay. I climbed in beside her, didn't ask questions, didn't offer speeches. I just pulled her close, wrapped my arm around her, and matched my breath to hers until we both fell asleep. When I woke the next morning, the light was slanting through the blinds, and her head was still on my chest. Her fingers were curled against. My shirt, like her body, had chosen me even while her mind wandered through old rooms. And that was when I realized love doesn't erase the past. It just builds something stronger in its shadow. The week after her ex-husband's call passed like slow-moving fog, not heavy enough to stop us, but thick enough that we could feel it in the spaces between conversations. She didn't bring it up again, and I didn't ask. That was our agreement, spoken not in words, but in trust. We'd give each other room, not space, not distance, but emotional permission to process without pressure. And still, I could feel her carrying it. Not like a weight exactly, but like a faint scent that clung to the edge of her presence. I noticed it in the way she lingered at the sink after doing dishes, or the way her eyes stayed fixed on the fireplace a little longer than usual. Lost in thoughts I didn't want to interrupt, there was no jealousy in me, no insecurity, just awareness. A subtle tightening in the chest that comes when someone you love is somewhere you can't follow. I made sure to show up more often that week, not with answers, not with expectations, but with steadiness. I ran errands with her, picked up groceries even when she said she didn't need anything, sat beside her while she organized drawers she'd ignored for months. These weren't grand gestures. They were small declarations. I'm not going anywhere. The more we shared these kinds of quiet hours, the more I began to realize something unexpected. This wasn't a love built on excitement. It was built on relief. The exhale after a long-held breath. The calm after years of learning how to survive. With her, I didn't feel like I had to perform, impress, or heal. I just had to be. And she gave that back in equal measure. That Friday, she invited me to a small dinner with a few close friends. Nothing fancy. It's just a potluck at a friend's house across town. When I arrived to pick her up, she was still getting ready. I sat on the edge of the bed while she moved around the room in soft, deliberate movements, choosing earrings, brushing mascara through her lashes, pausing occasionally to ask, "Too much?" Or, "What do you think of this one?" She wasn't fishing for compliments. She was sharing herself in a way that said, "I want to be seen tonight, and I want you to see me first." When we arrived at the dinner, I could feel the shift in her. She lit up differently around her people, not louder, but more open. She moved through conversations with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. And every so often, she'd glance my way, not to check in, just to remind herself that I was there. That this version of her, the one, laughing, storytelling, holding court around a dining table, was the same woman I held in silence. When the world felt too loud after dessert, one of her friends leaned over to me and said, "She seems lighter lately," like she finally stopped holding her breath. I didn't respond. I just nodded, letting the truth of that statement land somewhere deep in my chest. Because I could see it too. She was no longer living inside an old identity. She wasn't just a mother or an ex-wife or a woman healing from disappointment. She was becoming again, and I had a front row seat. Later that night, back at her place, we collapsed onto the couch, both of us still full from food and conversation. She tucked her feet beneath her and leaned against me with a sigh so content it felt like music. "You were good tonight," she said, her voice soft and drowsy, not just polite. Present. They saw it. I saw it. I wrapped my arm around her and let the moment stretch out, long and warm. Because she wasn't just complimenting my manners. She was thanking me for showing up fully, not as a role, but as a partner. We didn't make love that night. We didn't need to. The intimacy between us had grown so thick that even a shared blanket and quiet breathing felt like a vow. Her until her breathing slowed, until the room dimmed into sleep, and even then, I stayed awake a little longer, and not from anxiety. From all that somehow, two people who had stopped expecting much from love had found something worth expecting everything from again. In the morning, she made pancakes. From scratch, the kind with uneven edges and too much butter, just the way I liked them. We ate in pajamas at the kitchen counter, her hair still tangled from sleep. Sunlight slanting through the window and those golden beams that make everything feel a little more cinematic than real life should allow. She looked at me over her coffee and said, "I've stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I used to live in that space where good things meant bad things were coming. But with you, it just feels steady." That word echoed in me. Steady. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the language of fairy tales. But it was the truth. We weren't a whirlwind. We were a foundation. Built from listening, from patience, from every small moment neither of us had run from. And yet even in that steadiness I felt the tremble. Not from doubt, but from the bigness of it all. From how rare it was. From the question that had begun to form quietly in the back of my mind, what happens next? Because love like this doesn't stay neutral forever. It either grows or it shrinks. It either roots deeper or starts to drift. And I could feel us reaching that invisible edge, the part where you decide whether to keep walking separately through the same life or start stitching your days together more deliberately. We didn't talk about that edge that day, but we both felt it that night, lying beside her. I stared at the ceiling while she slept, the sound of her breathing rising and falling like the tide. I thought about my apartment, about how little time I spent there now, how her place had begun to carry the gravity of home, even though we'd never said those words. I thought about how I woke up earlier around her, drank less coffee, talked more about the future. I thought about how much of my world had started bending toward hers, not out of obligation, but because it finally made sense, and that was when I knew, soon. One of us would have to ask the next question, not because anything was wrong, but because everything finally felt right. It wasn't any single moment that pushed us forward. No dramatic turning point, no grand declaration. Just a buildup of presence so constant, so seamless, that moving forward no longer felt like a choice. It felt like gravity. Over the following week, that quiet edge we both sensed began to make itself more visible. Not through tension, but through repetition. She'd started referring to things as ours in casual conversation. Our Sundays, our corner store, our show, and I found myself leaving more than just a toothbrush behind. Socks, keys, chargers, a half-finished book on her nightstand. Without discussion, our lives were merging in the smallest, most decisive ways. And that's how the biggest shifts always begin, not with big moves, but with drawers that stop getting emptied and calendars that quietly sync. The idea of moving in didn't come from her. It didn't come from me either, not directly. It came from the silence between us on a Tuesday night, sitting on the couch, both of us scrolling our phones with our feet tangled together beneath the blanket. I had just told her about a minor plumbing issue at my place. Nothing urgent. It's just a slow drip under the bathroom sink end, she'd said, without looking up. You know, you don't have to keep that apartment forever. It was such a simple sentence, so lightly spoken, but it landed like a loaded question disguised as an observation. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We both let it hang there, and when she glanced up a moment later, our eyes met with the kind of quiet understanding that only comes from months of accumulated knowing. I didn't move in that night. I didn't even bring it up the next day, but inside me something had clicked. Something had settled. Not from pressure or even desire, but from the recognition that I already lived there in every way that mattered. My clothes hung in her closet. My schedule bent to hers. My mornings didn't feel right without the sound of her kettle hissing or the soft shuffle of her slippers across the hard wood. I didn't just love her, I inhabited life with her, and the idea of going back to the version of my life that didn't include her in my daily physical world felt more foreign than any future we hadn't spoken aloud. That weekend, we took a walk through her neighborhood just before sunset. Work! Air was cool but not biting, the kind of early winter crispness that made your hands seek warmth even when your body felt fine. We passed a few neighbors who nodded in recognitions, some of whom had started waving at me like I'd always been part of the backdrop. She held my hand without thought, fingers woven into mine like the gesture had always belonged to us. We rounded the corner. She paused near a small house for sale. It wasn't special, a little run-down, paint chipped, grass uncut, but something about the sight of it, the idea of what it could be, pulled her gaze. She didn't say anything. At first, just looked at it, then at me, and then back again. And I knew she wasn't asking if we should buy it. She was testing the shape of the word we in the real world. What it looked like to build something together instead of simply fitting into something already made. We didn't stop and talk about it. We didn't dream out loud or imagine renovations. We just stood there a little longer than necessary, and then we walked on, both of us storing something away for later. That night, over dinner, I found myself looking around her kitchen with new eyes. Not like a visitor, not even like a resident, but like someone memorizing the angles of a place they'd one day call their own. The cabinets, she always complained about being too shallow. The drawer that stuck unless you pulled it just right. The way the overhead light flickered sometimes before finally warming the room. None of it was perfect. And yet all of it felt like home. Kind of imperfections you grow to love because they belong to something real, something lived in, something chosen. She caught me looking and raised an eyebrow, playfully curious, but patient. I smiled and said, I think I'm already here. And she didn't blink. She didn't ask what I meant. She just reached across the table, placed her hand over mine, and said, I know. We didn't label anything that night. We didn't draft plans, or rearrange furniture, or sort through closets. But something had shifted, something permanent. It was in the way she turned off the porch light before bed like she'd done it for both of us. It was in the way I left my phone on her nightstand instead of my pocket. It was in the way her body curved into mine as we lay beneath the blanket. Neither of us saying a word, because every word had already been written into the way we moved. Around each other. Over the next few days, the transition became so natural, it barely needed narration. I began spending every night there. My apartment sat mostly untouched except for the occasional trip to pick up forgotten mail or grab a piece of clothing I hadn't yet brought over. But even those visits felt strange, like walking into a version of myself that no longer made sense. The bed felt colder, the rooms echoed, the air was thinner. And every time I stepped back into her home, I could feel my body exhale in relief. Like I'd been holding something in and didn't know it until I let it go again. One evening after, she finished grading a stack of student essays at the dining table. She came into the living room wrapped in a blanket, holding 2 mugs of tea. She passed one to me and curled up beside me, her head finding its usual place on my shoulder. We watched the firelight flicker for a while before she said, You know, when I asked if 52 was too old for love, I thought I already knew the answer. I thought I was asking rhetorically. I wasn't. I was asking for permission, and you gave it to me without even trying. I swallowed hard, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did, and it scared me. Because what I wanted to say wasn't light. It wasn't safe. It was the truth, and truths like that come with gravity. I turned to her, pressed, my forehead gently against hers, and whispered, "You were never too old for love. The world just forgot how to look at you. I didn't." She closed her eyes then, and we stayed like that for what felt like hours. That night, fell asleep to the sound of her breathing and the slow realization that I wasn't just in love, I was home. Life didn't shift overnight after that final affirmation. There wasn't some sudden crescendo, no flood of changes or sweeping transformations. That wasn't our way. What happened instead was far more subtle and far more permanent. We just kept showing up for each other day after day, till showing up didn't feel like something we were doing, it felt like who we were. And in that rhythm, something beautiful emerged. A life not built on adrenaline or infatuation, but on presence. She had become not just the center of my affection, but the place where all my energy naturally returned. My pause in the noise. My breath after the long run. Her house, once a place I entered cautiously, began to transform under our hands. Together we repainted the back room, not because it needed it, but because we were ready to mark time with something tangible. The room became hers again, a writing space, a sunroom, a quiet escape. But this time she didn't disappear into it alone. Some mornings I'd find her at the desk, glasses slipping down her nose, a notebook half filled with ink and coffee. Still steaming beside her, she didn't hide the pages from me anymore. Sometimes she'd read a paragraph aloud. Sometimes she'd let the silence stretch between us like thread, till the words found her again. There were still moments of uncertainty. Of course, we both carried old wiring habits from relationships past, echoes of years spent learning how not to need. But the difference now was that we didn't run from the discomfort. When it surfaced in a small misunderstanding, a tired moment, a missed cue, we stayed. We didn't threaten to leave. We didn't weaponize the past. We just breathed. Through it, gave it room, and let it move like weather. And more often than not, we'd come out the other side closer. Not in spite of the struggle, but because of it. One morning in late autumn, we decided again without much fanfare to clear out the attic. It had been her idea, but I could tell there was a deeper motive. The boxes hadn't been touched in years. Dust coated every lid like time itself had tried to bury them. We worked in silence, opening one at a time, sorting what to keep. What to let go? Old picture frames. A stack of greeting cards. Childhood art projects. She pulled out a small wooden box and sat down on the floor with it, cradling it in her lap. I watched her from across the room, knowing enough not to interrupt. Eventually, she opened it. Inside were photos, keepsakes, pieces of a version of her I had never met. She didn't need to explain. I sat beside her, and we sifted through it together. Later that night, after we'd cleaned up and showered, we sat on the couch with glasses of red wine and aching backs. She leaned into me and said, "You've made it easy to keep going." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't about fireworks. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, continuing felt like something she didn't have to force. That's what real partnership does. Doesn't fix what's broken. It reminds you that you're strong enough to carry what's left and loved enough not to carry it alone. Around that same time, I realized something quietly monumental. I hadn't thought about being alone in weeks, not out of fear, but because solitude had stopped being the default I returned to. I still had it. Sure, we both did, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't a wall I used to protect myself anymore. It was a room I chose to leave because another one was finally worth entering. I started keeping a journal again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Not because I needed to make sense of anything, but because I wanted to remember. I didn't want to forget how good it felt to build something with someone who wasn't trying to own me or rescue me, just meet me where I stood. One Sunday morning, she didn't ask if she could read it. She didn't flip through it. She just picked it up, pressed her hand to the cover and said, "I'm glad you're writing again." It was a small moment, but it held the weight of everything. Because she understood that I wasn't just journaling, I was taking inventory. Recording gratitude. Trying to wrap words around the kind of peace I didn't think I'd ever find this late in life. We had stopped talking about age months ago. It didn't come up anymore. The question she once asked, "Do you think 52 is too old for love?" had been so thoroughly answered by our lives together that it now felt irrelevant. Never tried to act younger than we were. We didn't chase adventure for the sake of keeping up. We just lived, fully, honestly, presently, and in that presence everything felt new again. Not because we were pretending, because we were paying attention. By the first frost, we were talking about the holidays, whether her kids might visit, whether we'd cook or keep it simple, whether we wanted to get a tree. I caught her staring at the mantel one evening, a measuring tape in hand, trying to decide if it could hold stockings. I didn't interrupt. I just watched her plan for a future that included me. That was all I needed. We hosted Thanksgiving, small, just for people. Her sister, one of my cousins who'd recently moved to town. We cooked all day. She made the stuffing from her mother's recipe. I burned the rolls. We laughed. We drank wine. We sat around a table that had once felt too big for just one person. And that night, when the house was quiet again, we stood in the kitchen with our hands in the sink and our hips touching, and she looked over at me with tired, happy eyes and said we did it. She wasn't talking about the meal. Weeks later, as snow began to settle lightly on the rooftops, I took her hand as we walked through town and led her into a small shop with warm lighting and shelves lined with handmade ceramics. I bought her a mug, heavy, earthy, perfect. She turned it over in her hands and said, "Why this one?" And I told her the truth, because it reminded me of you. Strong, soft, and made to be held every day. That night we drank tea out of that mug while sitting under a blanket we'd bought together at a flea market. The wind rattled the windows. The house creaked like it always did when the temperature dropped, and we stayed close, not saying much, not needing to, because we had become something whole, not flashy, not loud, but true, and in that truth, we rested. Finally, up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one. Hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.